For most of my working life, I always believed that if I could retire with around $3,000 a month coming in, I would be doing pretty well. It didn't sound like a fortune, but it sounded comfortable enough to live a normal life without worrying about every little expense. The surprise came when I actually retired, and that moment finally arrived, because something didn't add up the way I thought it would. $3,000 a month in America didn't feel comfortable at all. In fact, after rent and basic bills were paid, it barely felt like enough to keep the same lifestyle I had before. But what shocked me even more was what happened after I moved to the Philippines. Because suddenly that exact same $3,000 a month created a completely different kind of life. Before retirement, I had a regular job like a lot of people. I worked for decades, earned a steady paycheck, and built my life around the income that job provided. While I was still working, my monthly income was much higher than what I receive now. When you're working full-time, you might be bringing in $5,000, $6,000, sometimes even more depending on the job. When that's your income, things like rent, groceries, utilities, and gas don't feel quite as heavy because there's enough money coming in to support everything. Over the years, my life settled into a routine that felt normal. I had a place to live, a car, food in the fridge, and I could go out once in a while without feeling like every dollar needed to be carefully counted. The thing that many people don't realize about retirement is that your lifestyle often stays the same, but your income suddenly drops. When I stopped working, my income went down to around $3,000 a month, coming from Social Security and a small pension. On paper, that still sounded like a reasonable amount of money, but the reality started to look different once those same bills kept showing up every month. Housing was the biggest expense, just like it is for most people. My rent alone was close to $2,000 a month, and that wasn't for anything luxurious. It was just a normal apartment in a decent area. Once you add utilities like electricity, water, internet, and other basic services, that number climbs even higher. Groceries were another few $100s every month. And like everyone else, I noticed those prices seemed to rise every year. I remember one afternoon standing at the grocery store checkout watching the total climb higher and higher on the screen. I only had a few bags of normal food, nothing fancy, but the total was already pushing past $100. That was one of those moments where I started realizing just how much everyday life had changed. Then there were the other everyday costs that quietly drain your budget. Gas for the car, insurance, occasional doctor visits, and the random little expenses that always seem to appear when you least expect them. When my lease came up for renewal and the rent increased again, I remember sitting at my kitchen table looking at the numbers and thinking something wasn't right. If my income had gone down after retirement, but my rent and expenses kept going up, the math just didn't work anymore. I wasn't completely broke, but the lifestyle that once felt comfortable while I was working suddenly felt tight and stressful. Every month started to feel like a careful balancing act. Around that time, I started looking into how other retirees were stretching their retirement money. Like many people these days, I found myself watching videos and reading stories about Americans who had chosen to live overseas. One country that kept coming up again and again was the Philippines. People talked about the lower cost of living, the friendly communities, and the fact that English is widely spoken in many areas. What really caught my attention was hearing about retirees living comfortably on incomes that would feel very tight back in the United States. At first, I didn't take the idea too seriously. Moving to another country felt like something adventurous people did, not someone like me who had spent most of his life living in the same place. But the more I looked into it, the more I started wondering if the issue wasn't my retirement income at all. Maybe the real issue was simply the cost of living where I was. Eventually, curiosity turned into action. I decided to take the chance and see what life would actually be like somewhere else. I sold most of my furniture, packed a couple of suitcases, and made the long trip to the Philippines. I didn't know exactly what to expect when I arrived, but I was curious to see if the stories I had heard were really true. The first thing that surprised me was housing. In America, I had been paying nearly $2,000 a month for a fairly simple apartment. But in the Philippines, I was able to rent a large house for around $1,000 a month. The place had multiple bedrooms, a yard, and even a small pool. It wasn't some luxury mansion, but compared to what I had before, it felt incredibly spacious. Food was another big difference. Local markets were full of fresh vegetables, seafood, and meat prices that felt almost unbelievable compared to what I had been paying in the United States. Eating out occasionally didn't feel like a financial risk anymore. Utilities and transportation were also much lower, which meant that my monthly budget suddenly had breathing room again. What surprised me the most wasn't just the numbers, it was the feeling that came with them. Back in America, I was constantly thinking about money and calculating expenses in my head. Every decision felt like it had to be carefully measured against my monthly income. But here's something slowly started to change. My income hadn't increased at all. It was still the same $3,000 a month, but the lifestyle it created felt completely different. I remember sitting outside the first evening after moving into my house, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood and realizing something strange. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about the next bill that was coming in the mail. That quiet moment made me realize how much stress I had been carrying before. Sometimes I joke with friends back home that I live like a king now, but not the kind of king people imagine with luxury cars and expensive suits. It's more like a modest king, someone who simply has enough to live peacefully without constantly worrying about money. Of course, moving overseas isn't perfect, and it's not the right choice for everyone. There are adjustments that come with living in another country. The climate is different, the pace of life is slower, and things don't always work the same way they do in the United States. There are also important things to plan for, like visas, healthcare, and budgeting carefully for the future. But even with those adjustments, the biggest change for me wasn't just financial. It was a sense of relief that came with knowing my retirement income actually supported a comfortable lifestyle again. $3,000 a month felt tight when I was living in America, but in the Philippines it created a completely different experience. The money didn't change, but the environment around it did. That change alone made my retirement feel like a new chapter instead of a constant financial balancing act. Everyone's situation is different, but sometimes the biggest difference in retirement isn't how much money you have. Sometimes it's simply where you decide to live. And if you enjoy hearing real stories about retirement and life overseas, feel free to subscribe, because sometimes the biggest step isn't moving to another country. It's realizing that you actually have the option to.